I'm going to nip this in the bud right away. I think AC Brotherhood is a great game, and my overall opinion on Revelations, while less fond, is still positive. I have to make sure that point gets across early because the Ezio Trilogy is easily the most beloved era of the Assassin's Creed franchise to date. I think that sentiment is well earned. AC2 made Assassin's Creed one of the most popular franchises in the world and gave us one of the most popular video game protagonists in the world. Even after multiple revisits to all the games, it remains my favorite entry in the series. But as you can tell from this title, I'm not making this video to talk about how much I like AC2. I'm also not making it to say that I dislike Brotherhood or Revelations. However, there is an extent to which I believe the decision to make them at all was a net negative for the franchise. If you watched my video from last year titled When Did Assassin's Creed Get Bad?, you probably know where I'm going with this. Ubisoft's development of 2 add-on games to AC2 that would be made in parallel to AC3 led to huge shifts creatively, commercially, and behind the scenes at Ubisoft. The direction of the series changed dramatically, sales expectations skyrocketed, and the rate at which titles were scheduled became incredibly unrealistic. And yet people love Brotherhood and Revelations, not because they are misinformed or media illiterate, but because they are solid games. I have 100% completed both half a dozen times over the last decade. But they exist as the first symptoms of a greed and creative stagnation that plagues Assassin's Creed to this day, and sometimes I find myself thinking about where this franchise would be if these 2 titles never existed at all. There's a generation of players who don't remember when the franchise didn't have a new game lined up every year like clockwork. For a brief period between 07 and 09, the series was setting up to be something that feels very dissonant to what it is today, a trilogy. After raking in a ton of money for Ubisoft with Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time in 03, creative director Patrice Désilets was put in charge of developing the next big reboot for that series, which would morph into the first Assassin's Creed. While Désilets took his hands off the reins for Prince of Persia, resulting in sequels that were radically different from Sands of Time, he seemingly intended to see through his full vision for this new IP. He and his team at Ubisoft Montreal released AC1 to mixed reception and took the criticism they got to heart when making AC2, a game that received immediate critical acclaim. First-round jitters were gone, and a big cliffhanger left fans aching to know what would come next. However, while Désilets had some ideas on where exactly the series would go, the success of AC2 meant that Ubisoft now had other plans. Ezio was just too big of a face to give up on. Now, in the early 2010s, it was all the rage for popular games to be immediately followed up with side installments that basically reused the same assets. Whether it be Arkham Origins or Borderlands the pre-sequel, this concept was common in the PS3 era, and it did lead to some solid titles. However, while these projects were usually handed off to smaller teams while the original devs stuck to mainline titles, Désilets and his team were tasked with putting out this new game as part of Ubisoft's new development strategy. The intent was now to release new games every year, and in 2010, AC Brotherhood was unveiled as the first AC game to fit into this new schedule, with Call of Duty specifically cited as the inspiration for the idea. Obviously, this wasn't the original plan. Now, I can't speak to what happened behind the scenes at this point, but we know Désilets opted to leave Ubisoft before the completion of Brotherhood. Rumors circulated that it was this change in direction that pushed him from the company, but that's not something I can confirm. Now, every IP is a huge collective effort, but the 2 people who made up the public face of these games were Désilets as creative director and Jade Raymond as the producer, and then executive producer for AC2. With Désilets gone and Raymond sent to Toronto to manage a new studio there, the series would never really have individual creatives overseeing the IP again. Instead, the series would be passed around a revolving assortment of Ubisoft studios and creative leads with each installment. We can look at this graphic showcasing their development periods as of AC Origins, and even back then it was a mess. This one-team venture was split into 7 teams, and that's only accounting for the core studios. At one point, there was so much overlap that we had AC3, Liberation, 4, Rogue, Unity Syndicate, and Origins all in development only within 2012 to 2014. This ridiculous schedule began in 2010, and one fatal factor ensured that Ubisoft would not be warned off this road. Brotherhood came out, and it was great. It saw a huge graphical upgrade and a massive increase in content. It was one of the first games to really perfect the so-called Ubisoft formula with a wide variety of cool missions and story arcs to get lost in. All of this sits under the game's biggest addition, the surprisingly great multiplayer mode that could easily double your playtime on its own. In truth, I don't know how they did this in so little time. The game sold 7.2 million copies to AC2's 9 million, and it did so with half the dev time. If the company didn't know what they had in 2009, they did now. And with AC3 not slated until 2012, they now had a whole year to kill. At that time, they had already announced a 3DS title called Lost Legacy that would bridge the stories of Ezio and Altair. Maybe that fell through with Nintendo, or maybe Ubisoft just smelled a way to make more cash, but either way they decided they had time to fit in yet another full-priced console title instead. But this time, things would be different. For the first time, an AC game would have a new creative director, and instead of a single, centralized studio with experience working on this IP, the development of Revelations would be spread out over half a dozen Ubisoft studios. This sharp change in direction was very much felt in the finished product. There are some more subjective issues like the botched attempt at a new facial capture system that they didn't have the time to smooth out, but the biggest problem is that it absolutely decimated the content we had in Brotherhood. In my When Did AC Get Bad video, I put together this list of side missions that weren't just collectible quests in Brotherhood, compared to what we got in Revelations, and there's just no contest. Brotherhood had a ton of side missions and unique maps, new real estate and assassin recruitment systems, district control mechanics, and a slew of faction quests. While Brotherhood expanded on AC2 in nearly every way, Revelations used its gorgeous new setting to mask the fact that outside of the story, almost everything was either reskinned or removed. It has no side missions with unique maps, a fraction of the faction quests, and the tombs were integrated into the main story to pad out its shorter narrative. What is left are things like the multiplayer, property buying, Templar towers, and assassin recruitment, all of which were just copy-pasted from the last game. It removed a ton and added very little, a sure sign of rushed development. And yet, Revelation sold 7 million copies, nearly as much as Brotherhood despite having much less content. Say what you will, but this method was paying off for Ubisoft. 3 games became 4, 4 became 5, 5 became 13, and now 13 is poised to become 20 before the decade is done. With the success of Brotherhood and Revelations, the company realized they didn't need a dedicated AC team. They could just have a bunch of studios working concurrently to churn out titles on a yearly basis, and with Revelations, they realized they didn't even need to match the level of content of the previous entry to maintain their sales. Judging by the returns the series would continue to see throughout that console generation, this was by far the most lucrative move at the time. But with yearly releases as the new norm and the original creative team gone, Brotherhood became a success that Ubisoft would never recover from. Ezio is the main focus of these games, but his story isn't the one that suffers the most from this decision to pack in 2 games past his intended conclusion. It's the story of his descendant, Desmond Miles, that was irreparably ruined in all this mess. The historical storylines of these games were always an anthology, so they were always free to stand alone. Desmond never had that luxury. His sections were derided by fans and critics alike from the beginning because of how dissonant they felt from the meat of the game. He walks around an empty office in AC1 and he beats up a few guards in AC2, but this man was slated to save the world from the apocalypse. Something big had to be around the corner. And at least it should have been. AC2 was supposed to lead right into Desmond's concluding episode, but with Brotherhood now coming out, they had to fit a whole nother game's worth of story in there. Now to Brotherhood's credit, they didn't settle for just giving him nothing to do to pass the time. While his role remains minimal, the shocking conclusion to his story in that game was the biggest narrative step he had ever gotten to take. With his closest ally dead on the ground by his own unwilling hand, that cut to black left us on the edge of our seats. But we wouldn't get more. Revelations was once again never supposed to exist, and this time AC3 was way further along in development, and they were already figuring out that story. So how do you write the 4th chapter of a narrative when the 5th chapter is already almost done? Well, you make your characters sleep through it. While I'm sure there was a brief period when Revelations was still Lost Legacy and AC3 was going to pick up right from where Brotherhood left off, the addition of Revelations meant that this whole story couldn't interfere with what was already written for AC3, so Desmond would be trying to wake up from a coma while his mind was stuck in the digital depths of the Animus. A huge casualty of this was Kristen Bell as Lucy Stillman. Ubisoft was willing to pay her for 3 games, and they got 3 games from her. But because Brotherhood was now the 3rd game, it means Lucy died halfway through Desmond's story instead of at the end. And while we hoped that might lead to something so it would at least seem planned, Revelations barely addressed her death, telling us she was a double agent in what was probably the worst DLC the series had ever put out, and leaving it at that. In all honesty, Désilets' existing notes for the original ending of the series seem absolutely baffling. But having AC3 start with Desmond and Lucy alive trying to save the world right off the tail of AC2 would have at least given the characters a chance to reach conclusions that felt informed by narrative, not payroll. Instead of spending 3 years working on the story for AC3, the writers were forced to build off Desmond's constantly changing narrative as more just kept being added. AC3 famously went on to botch its modern-day ending with a story that threw away Warren Vidic, Daniel Cross, and Desmond in one unceremonious go. There was so much this series was setting up in those first 2 games that just goes nowhere when the whole trilogy idea falls apart, especially when it comes to Subject 16. Remember back when he was hiding riddles and pointing Desmond toward finding a mysterious woman named Eve? Remember when he seemed to know all the answers but he was just too weak to tell you, and then you meet him in Revelations and he has nothing to say? In a world where these games were coming out every single year, there was no space for an engaging, overarching plot, and modern day has been nearly non-existent since AC3. The decision to milk more games out of the series and make them yearly endeavors killed the modern day portion of the game, and the extension of Desmond's saga from 3 games to 5 totally ruined any sense of cohesion he had in his narrative. Ezio is a fantastic character that I myself am more attached to as a result of spending 3 years playing as him instead of just 1. However, my most subjective take of the video is that I think that something is lost by diluting the ending he got in AC2. Before being the star of a multimedia epic, Ezio had a complete arc that was confined to a 10 to 15 hour narrative. He was charismatic but inexperienced, with a story that showcased the loss of his youth to his quest for revenge. There is a melancholy scene near the end of AC2, where Ezio sits on a bench on his birthday, and all he can think about is the fact that after 10 years of hunting his family's killers, he is no closer to understanding what they died for. Cut ahead to the ending, and Ubisoft made a discerned effort not to give him a big, heroic finale. Instead, an older Ezio walks into the vault that his family died to protect after 23 years of searching for answers, only to realize he was just a conduit for a message that those who came before had for Desmond. Ezio's final words are a plea for the being in front of him to tell him what it was all for. You could interpret it as begging, and that is the last we see of Ezio Auditore. I always thought there was a level of boldness to ending his story on such a low note. As a reminder, this was once meant to be the entirety of his story arc. Ezio did great and heroic things, but the writers decided to end it on his point of uncertainty here. So what happens when you then add 2 games worth of story to an ending like this? Well, there are 2 aspects of Ezio's continued narrative that I want to focus on: the nuance that he lost, and the closure that he gained. After the growth he had in AC2, Ezio's primary character trait becomes being cool. He almost never shows signs of uncertainty or lapses in judgment, and he has become the mentor to the characters around him. He is driving tanks, saving Jesus, and all his villains run for their lives at first sight of him. I don't see this as an exclusively bad thing. Brotherhood is the culmination of the character growth we saw in AC2, and it's awesome to see him in his prime. Revelations, however, tuned up this cool factor to 11 in a way that felt more fast and furious than I would have liked. While the game makes an effort to give Ezio more introspective dialogue than the last game, the actual events of the story see him performing superhuman feats that dwarf anything he did in the past. The game starts with him charging a Templar army without a weapon, and it ends with a janky mid-air fistfight while falling off a cliff. Ezio was always cool, but by Revelations he had become an outright superhero. While he may say he is getting old and slow, this is a tell-don't-show situation. The only time he actually slows down narratively is when he is blown off a cliff by a 16th century hand grenade, and even that is followed up by a "you're locked in here with me" encounter where his target doesn't even land a blow on him. But underneath the bombastic MCU-style plot is a part of the narrative that I generally see people praise, and that is the closure that he gets, which is best exemplified in the finale for the game. Ezio finds Altair's body, pays his respects, and finds another piece of Eden. Instead of taking it, he decides that he is ready to let his conflicts go, posits that Desmond must be hearing him, and puts his hand on his shoulder to usher him into a cutscene setting up AC3. This scene directly mirrors the ending of AC2, except Ezio has now inverted his role. Instead of being talked at like he doesn't exist, he takes control and does the talking himself. Instead of being left with a sense of uncertainty, he is more sure of himself than he has ever been. People love this scene because it respects Ezio and it gives him closure. I understand that, and I appreciate it, but personally I think this closure takes away from the kick that AC2 had. Ending a story in an open-ended way can mean a few things. In Empire Strikes Back, Luke loses his hand and finds out his greatest enemy is his own father, so as to make victory in the sequel all the more satisfying. Dissonance is created so that it can be resolved. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have a movie like 1967's The Graduate, which has one of the most iconic final scenes in film history. After our protagonist fulfills his hero's journey, the audience is left not with a triumphant melody, but instead with the somber tunes of Simon and Garfunkel, as the characters begin to process the uncertainty of what comes next. The ending of AC2 is left purposefully unsatisfying in a very similar way. The audience doesn't know if it was all worth it in the end, because Ezio doesn't know. We aren't handed the answers and are forced to come to terms with this on our own, just like Ezio. But Revelations leaves nothing up to the imagination. He accepts his decision to spend decades fighting in his family's memory.
For 3 decades, I have served the memory of my father and my brothers, and fought for those who have suffered the pain of injustice. I do not regret those years.
He accepts his role as a prophet who will never get the whole story.
But I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding.
And in AC Embers, he makes it clear he believes he lived a life worth living.
And now, in the twilight of my life, this understanding has passed into contentment.
Emotional speech after emotional speech, all beautifully delivered by Roger Craig Smith, but this beauty that has led so many people to love Revelations is a big part of why I'm torn on it. We went from fading to black in a moment of confusion and desperation to what is essentially a cascade of emotional monologues showcasing unbreakable self-assuredness. This isn't an objectively bad thing, and I'm not saying that you have to dislike Revelations' conclusion, but I miss the nuance Ezio was once allowed to have. The boldness in letting him fail sometimes, letting him struggle with obsession, letting him have that uncertainty. When I was younger, I really valued that. Instead, he will forever be remembered as an infallible superhero. I understand why people appreciate having a game that reconciles his lack of certainty in his life choices, but for me something was lost in tying everything up in such a neat bow. He saves the damsel in distress, defeats every enemy in his path, and essentially lives happily ever after. A far cry from his original intended ending. What really bothers me is that this nuance wasn't just taken away because the writers believed they had more stories to tell. Quite the opposite. By this point, the original writers of the series had either gone or moved on to AC3, so they didn't have input in the finale of this character. Ezio's story was continued because Ubisoft believed they could rush out a new game in 11 months to soak up some cash before AC3, and I think he deserved better than that. I have a lot of love for the Ezio trilogy. None of this is really the fault of these two games. They aren't the reason the series turned to yearly releases, shorter dev time, less creative cohesion, and the milking of a beloved character. They're just the first symptoms. Plenty of franchises have had immensely successful entries without studios feeling the need to then make sequels every single year, so I'm not blaming the state of AC on the success of these games. But at the same time, Brotherhood is where the rot had set in. It was a great game that should not have existed. Désilets and his team should have been sent straight to AC3 so they could do it right in time for 2012. Instead, AC became the poster child for endless, rushed releases. Now, I'm going to give what I think might be a somewhat hot take here. I don't think Assassin's Creed needs a definitive ending. I think it works as a popcorn fun anthology with regular releases with no end in sight if that is what they want to do. I'm not here to say that this series had to be a trilogy that ended 12 years ago and was never revisited. But what I am saying is that we could have had a middle ground. We could have given Desmond the story he deserved while still developing a 10-year plan for the series after him. We could have given Ezio more games without cramming them into sub-1-year dev periods. We could have tasked more studios with making these games without pushing out those who made them so successful in the first place. The decision to make Brotherhood and Revelations was Ubisoft telling us exactly what we were going to get. They were going to milk this franchise for all it was worth and put as little money and time into entries as possible so long as the return was there. I am glad to have Brotherhood and Revelations. I have played both of them over and over for half my life. But when I look at where the series ended up as a result of the corporate decisions that got them made, I find myself wishing that they didn't exist. That is all I have. My discussion here comes from a place of love for the franchise, and I think it is fair to be critical of things we like, but do feel free to chat with me about how you feel about the Ezio trilogy, either in my comments here or in my Patreon, which is linked below. Otherwise, have a great day, and take care of yourself.